I parked the pickup at the edge of the field and sat for a moment with the engine idling while I double-checked my kit like it was a prayer. I was a municipal field surveyor, the kind who spent more hours with a total station on a tripod than talking to people, a person who trusted coordinates more than rumor. That morning the sky was flat and the grass sat heavy with dew, the kind of place a mapmaker calls uninspiring and history forgets. My checklist ran through my head the way a pilot recites before taxiing the plane, inventoried and precise. Total station calibrated, GNSS receiver warmed and locked, spare batteries, compass cleaned, range poles straight, notebook on hand. The job was routine boundary verification for a parcels reassessment, a 2-hour walk around a property line, an uneventful day on the books. The monotony was comforting until the instruments started to behave like people with secrets. The GNSS lost fix for long enough to make me think about nearby canyons of iron. The compass whimpered a few degrees off its mark. The total station flashed a coordinate that did not exist on my plan. Those were small sins, but in my profession, small sins accumulate into real errors. My chest tightened the way it does when something in the field is wrong, and I had a responsibility to report it, not for spectacle, but for safety. I found the opening by accident, by a margin of grass taller than the rest, and a circle of ground that did not seem to age the same way. It was a shaft, the mouth of something vertical and deliberate sunk into the center of a fallow square of earth, a circular rim of concrete with bolts corroded and a heavy hatch set flush with the ground. There were no tracks leading to it, no signs of machinery, just a tidy ring as if someone had sat it down and left it alone for years. The hatch bore a small metal plaque, pitted and unreadable at first glance, and next to it a small green indicator, an LED set in a seam, glowing steady and alive. My professional instincts clicked into place. I took measurements, documented the coordinates, photographed the plaque with the camera, and ran a quick spectrum check for any electromagnetic interference. Nothing explained how such a shaft had been placed exactly where it sat. The thought rose like a tide. Whatever this was, it was not on any municipal record. I could have walked away, filed the anomaly, called the office. Instead, I set my hand on the hatch and felt the cold bite of metal, a shiver that was less about temperature and more about decision. I hesitated, then I unlatched it. The first steps down were ordinary at first. A ladder of steel folded into a shaft that smelled of concrete, old oil, and something sweet and mineral at the back of the throat. The light from above narrowed like the mouth of a camera lens, and then the shaft opened into a room I should not have expected to find 3 meters under a field in a place with no service records. It was an atrium of concrete and polished tiles, an angular hollow with benches bolted to the walls and a bank of numbered cubicles. Each cubicle had a small placard, numbers stamped in a typeface that echoed municipal signage. There were luminaires overhead, bulbs humming with an even, clinical light. My senses sharpened. I could taste the metallic tang in the air, feel fine grit under my boots, hear the low buzz of hidden motors, smell a faint scent of old paper and oil. I moved through the space with the methodical calm of someone cataloging evidence. Photographed the cubicles, logged the coordinates inside the atrium, swiped my compass along the railing, and noted the field anomalies. There were no footprints except my own, and a few partial scuffs, like someone had brushed the floor with a heavy bag. On a bench lay a child's shoe, small, fabric chewed at the seams, a contact lens case snapped open, a break in a pencil. Those were breadcrumbs that made the skin at the back of my neck prickle. I called in, the radio conversation low but real. "Hale, this is Mark. I found something. I am going down." Inspector Hale on the municipal roster replied with the kind of voice that unspooled bureaucracy and caution. "Mark, do not do anything you would not do with a confined space team. Document and wait." I told him I understood, though I was already into the next level, compelled by a professional arrogance that mixes with curiosity until you cannot tell one from the other. The corridor beyond the atrium contradicted its intentions with childish signage nailed to its walls.
One sign read, "Keep to the left," and another read, "No allergy zone," both as earnest and absurd as notes left on an abandoned porch. In one alcove, a poster with a diagram of a building plan had been taped and then thumbed so many times the paper had gone soft. The plan was not a building I recognized. It showed concentric rings, rooms that curved into one another like shells, a notation in the corner that said Blueprint Version Main 07 with a stamp from a lab I had never heard of, the Halley Institute. The whole place felt like an administrative joke that had gradually learned how to be serious. My backstory, in a way that explained why I went further, came up in my head unbidden. I had grown up in a town of canals where basements gathered more stories than the attics. My father worked in public works and would take me to dig sites when summer sun softened my skin. I had learned to measure not because I loved numbers, but because measurement was how you proved you had been
somewhere and found truth in the mud. I had been trained in urban rescue mapping for a brief period, taught to listen to floors and to read the sigh in pipes. Those lessons were practical and the kind that make a person obey process before impulse. But there was also the private piece. My sister Elena had disappeared when she was 17, leaving a room full of notes and an old camera with the film removed. I spent years cataloging what she left, which taught me to look for small details that others shrugged off. I did not go into shafts to be a hero. I went because I had been trained to find the edges of things, and because unresolved holes had a way of naming themselves to me, like lost relatives. The hallway into which I stepped smelled suddenly of boiled fabric and lemon. The lights shifted to a colder tone, and there were doors on each side, each with a small window. Behind one I glimpsed a clinic-like space, a curtained bed, a tray with instruments arranged with obsessive neatness. The instruments were not surgical, but they were clinical, metal loops and tools with notches, labels on drawers reading maintenance, quarantine, records. A clipboard hung by a clip with a list of names that included Jonah Reyes, Rosa Mendez, Dr. Patel, and others. A sticky note in a different handwriting said, "Maintenance after hours only," with an arrow that pointed to nothing. I called out softly, "Hello? Anyone here?" My voice tasted wrong in the corridor, thin as dust. For a moment there was no answer, then a rustle as if something shifted far down the passage. I walked on. It did not take long before I found evidence of other people who had not left happily. A cubicle had been sealed with yellow tape that smelt faintly of solvent, and inside lay a tangle of cords and a broken instrument that looked like a detector I used on the surface for buried utilities. There were notes scribbled on the back of utility bills, dates crossed out, names repeated. A photograph pinned to the wall showed a group of people standing in a field with a hatch identical to the one I had entered. In the photograph, Mayor Conway smiled in a way that meant local papers and ribbon cuttings. To the side of the photograph, someone had scrawled in a shaky hand, "You are not allowed to leave." My stomach dropped. There was the first small conversation with someone else who clearly had been here and had not wanted to be. "You should leave," said a voice behind a door as I knelt to examine the photograph. "You do not belong here." I responded without thinking, "Who is there? Are you injured?" The door shuffled, and a woman stepped into the corridor, with a clear face and eyes like river stones. "My name is Rosa," she said. "I was cleaning the records, and then—" Lights started, and then the doors did not open. My throat tightened as I catalogued her words like they were data. "How long have you been here?" I asked. "Long enough," she replied. "Long enough for the rules to stick." As I went deeper, the architecture became an argument against scale. Corridors narrowed and then widened into places that felt like rooms borrowed from other buildings. A space that should have been a kitchen had a hospital sink and a rack of mugs labeled with names like Jonah, Elena, Mark, in a handwriting that was both my own and not mine for a breath. The scent of warm bread fought with the metallic bite of antiseptic. The light fell in bands like a shuttered theater. and through a thin seam I heard water like a faraway ocean, a sound that should not have existed 100 feet under pasture. The strange familiarity of domestic things placed where they could not logically be made my mind reach for memory. I thought of my childhood pantry and the way my mother hung jars on pegs. The building seemed to be reusing found images as architecture, like a fever dream stitched with pieces of ordinary life. The tension escalated when I found a chamber arranged like a small office, with a desk and a drafting table. On the table was a set of blueprints, rolled and labeled with precise penmanship. Blueprint, Subterranean Annex, version 11. The plans were detailed to a maddening degree, showing rooms within rooms, shafts leading to other shafts, notations in a bureaucratic voice about maintenance intervals and the frequency of checks. A stamp read, Halley Institute, reviewed, and another stamp had a date that matched no municipal record. There were notes in the margins, shorthand like directives. Keep circulation at nominal rate. Do not allow more than one egress. Do not tamper. A map stuck to the wall had red ink that formed a spiral, and at its center a symbol that repeated throughout the space, a small square with a dot that mirrored the green LED at the hatch mouth. That was when the environment changed from curious to hostile. The lights hummed lower and then stuttered. A far door banged shut like an argument. The hair along my arms stood up. A presence was suggested by the pattern of the place, like a set of rules that if broken would produce consequences. The first true confrontation came in a room that appeared at once familiar and impossible. It looked like a temporary field hospital, with stretchers, monitors with gentle green readouts, and a wall of screens that should have been connected to servers, but instead displayed windows of other spaces within the structure. Each screen was a small scene, a corridor folding into itself, a room with a single chair, a stairwell that descended into black. On one screen, a figure sat in a chair and did not move. When I looked up, the figure in the chair looked back. I cannot describe the way my breath left me because words fail the sensation, but the room tightened like a fist around my ribs. The monitors emitted a low, pulsing sound that matched my heartbeat, and then the power flickered. I spoke aloud, perhaps out of reflex or documentation. "Who are you?" The chair turned slowly, and Jonah stepped out of shadow, rubbing his temple like someone who has been dragged awake. "You should not be here," he said, voice a whisper. I asked, "How long have you been watching?" And he answered, "Long enough to know when the screens start to look like windows, you are in trouble." We traded short sentences, the kind that are more about establishing that both of us were present than exchanging ideas. "We came to check maintenance," Jonah said. "We came together, and then we were separated." "By what?" I asked. "By rules," he answered. I had a moment of clarity that was both professional and personal. The blueprints were not accidental. Someone had planned this. The notations about maintenance suggested periodic checks and an institutional memory. The presence of names and personal items hinted at experiments in habitation rather than utility. The object that had invited me in the field was not a simple access point. It was an interface, and the interface had rules. That understanding changed how I moved. I tested doors the way I would test a valve, listening for pressure changes, feeling the way the air moved through gaps. A panel swung open, and behind it was a maintenance hatch with a handwritten schedule and the names of technicians, including Dr. Patel, who had been listed as a consultant, and an Inspector Hale, who had signed off on version 3. I whispered the names, as if invoking authority might make something happen. The place responded by making a metallic sound like a key sliding into a lock. Escape was not immediate. I tried to retrace my steps and found corridors that had rearranged themselves like a book shelved in the wrong order. The ladder up from the atrium led to a landing that opened onto a corridor I did not recognize. Panic is a physical thing that arrives in stages. First comes the tightness across the chest, then the hot rush in the palms, the ground tilting, the sense that the map you carry is no longer true. I executed a maneuver I had practiced only once in a training exercise under fluorescent lights, crawling through a maintenance duct and pulling myself by metal ribs until my forearms burned and my clothing snagged. My hands were gritty with old insulation, and I could taste the dust like iron. At the surface, I expected sunlight, but instead found a narrow service staircase that belched cold air scented with grass. I climbed, 2 steps at a time, fingers raw, and came out into a room that faced into a low lobby with a bank of switches. Switches were painted with names, and one switch had a padlock with a tag that read, "Do not tamper," in marker that smeared when my thumb brushed it. There were moments of acute memory that stitched into the present and drove decisions. As I worked the switches, thinking to isolate power or to trigger an alarm, I remembered being a child and watching my mother wind a clock. The slow, methodical movement made sense to me. It also became tactical. I flipped the switch labeled ventilation, and a gust moved down the corridor like a warning. There was a sudden tin of sound like bells in the distance, and then a door slammed somewhere below, a punctuation. I had more short interactions that felt like interviews. "Mark, stay put," Inspector Hale said over the radio when he finally connected again. "We are assembling a team. Do not engage anything that looks like it was made to be friendly." I answered, "There is evidence of habitation and a blueprint that names people. I found Jonah and Rosa. I am trying to map egress." He said, "Do not separate. Keep to the surface if you can. And Mark, be careful with doors that have signs." Signs in that place were not helpful. They were traps of suggestion. The territory around the spiral of levels widened into a place that was not measured in floors, but in moods. There was a subterranean grove with stiff black trees that glowed faintly like embers, leaves rustling with a sound like static. It smelled like wet loam and warm wood, and as a child memory came back of walking with my father under autumn trees and the sound of leaves like coins. I felt followed, a pressure at the nape of my neck, like when someone breathes on the back of your hand. I moved through the grove and found an object that should not have been there. A small carved toy boat, painted blue with a name scrawled on the side, Elena. My breath stalled. The place folded grief and menace into a single image. I knew then that the architecture was tuned to people, that it borrowed the intimate to lure the curious. I also found small signs of other victims: a scarf knitted by someone with a tight hand, a thermos with initials, a note in a hidden pocket that read, "We were told to obey the light." The symbols repeated, the square with a dot, the little LED like an eye. At the bottom I found the blueprint room again, and in it a file drawer that yielded records. They were bureaucratic and monstrous at once. Maintenance logs recorded periodic entries with dates and initials, versions of policies that gradually became impossible. An entry from a year ago read, "After last inspection, people reported dreams of someone calling their name and no action was taken." Another entry from later said, "Protocol changed to limit egress during low cycle," and noted that test subjects were required to remain on site. The word subjects made my stomach drop. I also found a roster with names I recognized from the photograph, plus unfamiliar names like Elena Gibson and Marco Alvarez, and a stamped note that read, "Keep circulation nominal, do not permit more than 1 exit per node." The thought landed like a stone. This was not an accident. It was a designed environment where movement was constrained, where doors were instruments and signs were rules. The realization hinted at intent, and intent implies authorship. The escape was improvised and ugly. We rigged a pulley from a maintenance winch, Jonah and I, with Rosa holding a flashlight and calling coordinates into my radio. Dr. Patel appeared as if conjured by need, a narrow woman with a lab bag and a face that had been awake too many nights. "You cannot pull everything at once," she said bluntly. We argued the physics in 2 or 3 quick exchanges, voice clipped like bandages. "If we overload the winch, the cable will snap," Jonah warned. "We have to got a manual override somewhere," I said.
"There is a manual crate at the hub," Dr. Patel replied. We worked by touch and memory as the shaft complained with groans, and the mechanism released with a sound like a long-drawn breath. The ladder rattled and my gloves slipped on greasy metal, and for a moment I thought we would not make it. I felt sharp edges bite into my palms, tasted dust, smelled oil and sweat, and the physicality of climbing to air was a fierce, tactile relief. When at last we surfaced, the field lay unchanged and stupidly ordinary, the sky pale like a bruise. The hatch close with a soft click, and the green LED winked like a promise. At the surface, we met Inspector Hale, who had organized a small emergency team that included a technician named Marco Alvarez, a municipal lawyer called Elena Soto, and a photographer named Jonah had introduced earlier, who now worked to make sense of images. Hale said little and nodded often, a man whose face was cultivated to be unreadable. We filed reports, photographs, and the names of those we had found. The municipality opened a nominal investigation, and for a week headlines asked questions with polite curiosity. I handed over the blueprints and the maintenance logs to a committee that smelled of coffee and authority. They read the pages with the same polite disbelief as the public. One council member, Deputy Linton, called the documents anachronistic, and a local news anchor, Mara, asked whether the Haley Institute existed at all. The institute's name did not appear in public registries. Each official answer introduced 2 more questions. A month passed, and the field became a rumor-turned-municipal footnote. The committee sealed the hatch and called it a safety hazard pending review, performed test digs that turned up nothing but compacted soil. Neighborhood forums speculated and then moved on. People
Snapped photos where the hatch had been, posted them with captions like, "You would not believe it," and then replaced their lives. 3 months later, there was a brief mention in a local paper that some maintenance equipment had been damaged by unknown persons and that a private contractor had been hired to secure the perimeter. The records the contractor filed were terse and bureaucratic. 6 months on, an anonymous tip led a reporter named Mara to submit a Freedom of Information request that returned partially redacted documents, pages with stamps and signatures, and a 2-line memo that contained a single phrase in bolded type, "Authorized culling of nodes under review." Those words suggested a program of removal, an administrative euphemism for something deeper. I kept thinking about the carved toy boat with Elena written on it. The residual effects were practical and personal. I began to lose sleep, waking at odd hours to the sound of motors I could not locate. I developed a habit of checking the closets in my house as if looking for a hatch. My sister Elena still had not been found, but for the first time a private investigator who had once worked with my father reached out and said there had been patterns in missing persons that overlapped with the municipal zones. He was a man named Sanchez who spoke in a gravel voice and sent me lists and a worn map that matched the spiral motif from the blueprints. I kept a small folder at my bedside with copies of the maintenance logs and the photograph of the group in the field. On certain nights, a memory surfaces, not my memory, but a sense like a film, scratched in one place, of a distant metallic chime like an elevator shaft. I carry that sound like a talisman now. The last image I have is simple and quiet and impossible. I returned to the field at dawn under the pretext of checking a control marker that had shifted on the cadastral survey. The hatch had been sealed with a fresh coat of paint and a municipal lock. I stood for an hour, hands jammed in my pockets, listening. The LED in the seam blinked once from beneath the paint like the eye of something waking. Then it went dark. I left, but kept the coordinates. If the reader has ever faced a choice like the one I had, there is a small selfishness in admitting what you did. When I found the shaft, I chose to descend. I chose to touch the they that had been installed into the earth. I chose to record and to tell, and that telling is why my hands still tremble sometimes when I walk over fields that are too flat. If you were in my place, would you push the hatch closed and run, or would you open it to see what is inside? Tell me in the comments. Start your reply with apertaria, if you. You would push, or documentary if you say you would document and leave. I read a selection of comments and respond because the way different people react becomes part of how I think about what to do next. There is no neat answer. The municipality closed the story as an anomaly, and some papers ran with the mystery before the public turned its attention elsewhere. 3 months after the initial descent, a contractor named Elena Soto contacted me quietly and said they had found evidence of other sites with similar seals in nearby counties. She spoke in low tones on the phone and offered coordinates she would not put in an email. 6 months after, I received an envelope with a single photograph, edges burned and curled, showing a child on a stair with a toy boat. On the back was a single line in a handwriting I recognized from the maintenance logs. Keep circulation nominal, do not permit more than one egress. The photograph smelled faintly of smoke. I kept the photograph, and I keep the blueprints, and I walk a little differently. I have nightmares of stairwells that widen into forests, and of signs that shift their meaning while you read them. The final fact is that the green LED beneath the painted hatch has appeared in dreams and in the periphery of my vision, like a notice. I have learned to check my instruments twice and to distrust the ease of answers. If you want me to pursue this further, subscribe, and I will upload the redacted documents and the full set of photographs. If you have seen anything similar, start your reply in the comments with the word you chose and your name. I will read them and I will respond. For now, I leave you with a line I cannot shake when the wind comes off the field. Sometimes the ground keeps what we leave behind, and sometimes it gives back something we did not know we lost.